Hello and welcome. We're going to be looking at, in this video, we're going to be looking at understanding various cultural perspectives and basically giving you a toolkit of the things that you can use to help you to interpret texts that have been written by people from a number of different cultural backgrounds and perspectives. Now, any real text will basically require you to do this because virtually every text you read will come from a perspective that isn't your own. As in, everyone thinks their own way and thinks in their own style. So when you're going to be looking at this, you're going to still be trying to at least sort of do it in a way that you can understand a fair bit about an author's perspective. So to understand as much as you can based on the things that you can get to grips with. And it's basically about developing empathy and understanding of the various ways in which people live, the things they believe in and their values, and not doing it on a tokenistic level. So if you look at the image there, you will see it being achieved on a tokenistic level, as in by wearing big straw hats, they think that they're fitting in. Chances are they aren't. So by basically acting in that way, they are feeling like, well, they're connecting with the what they perceive as being culture, but really what they're doing is they're just basically giving a very tokenistic gesture and one that's not really representative of the way that they live. Okay, so why are we looking at cultural perspectives and what's the purpose? What's it going to benefit you? Or how's it going to benefit you? Well, quite simply, the texts that you encounter are composed from a different perspective from your own, as I've just mentioned. So the one thing that you'll find that when you're studying a text is you're basically trying to read someone else's words and interpret everything from their perspective as your perspective. And obviously, when you try and do that, it's like trying to tell the story of a pilot from the perspective of someone who's on the ground. It's going to be a completely different story. So, basically, to write about someone's different perspective, you're going to have to understand a little bit about it and to be able to, not only that, but actually to help you in reading it. So, whatever they've or in interpreting it. So whatever is written, whatever is filmed, whatever is composed, you are essentially getting a bit of a background and certainly a lot more knowledge than if you're just going in raw and cold and basically not knowing anything about the context, the perspective, or the belief system of the person who composed the text. So knowing about these different perspectives make it a lot easier. So when you're actually in the process of reading or interpreting a text, the more you understand, much easier it is to interpret it. So if you're reading or watching something and find yourself struggling to understand it, then you need to really look at the cultural perspective of it and see if you can find a little bit about their value system, where they're coming from, and it's going to be more likely then that you'll be able to interpret it not only as text but its content and its style as well. Okay. So how do you understand culture? Well, culture is multifaceted. As in, it differs between nations and communities, and there's a lot of parts which it makes up. So basically, it's to identify someone's culture, you need to look at a number of different factors and a number of different aspects of their being, which basically altogether will equal culture. So think of it as a number of parts that equal a whole. It's defined and influenced by these parts. Lifestyle, so the way that they live, the way that they live each day. Their nationality, so what country they call home, where roughly they come from. Their religious and spiritual practice, and this has a very heavy influence, particularly on a lot of classic texts and certainly a lot of texts from different cultural backgrounds, and certainly even just looking at it in terms of an Australian background, and even though you could consider Australia to be a nation moving further away from religion, it's still a lot of our values and a lot of our laws and our cultural beliefs are still sort of governed by religious practice, and certainly by our past religious practice. If they're one of those people who don't really believe in any sort of deity or spirit, they still sort of cotton onto a lot of the values that have been sort of passed on from that religious practice. The values and customs. So, in other words, the things that they hold dear, the sorts of customs that they basically incorporate into everyday life, what's polite, what's not polite, manners, and so forth. Their wealth, as in where they fit in the class structure, in the class hierarchy, whether they're rich, whether they're not rich. And the geography, as in where exactly they live, where they what their land actually looks like, if it's affected by drought, if it's mountainous. All these things affects one's culture because it's going to affect basically the things that you can eat, the things that you can do, the places you can go. All of those things are going to be influenced literally by the way the place is laid out. And even certain advances in technology haven't basically stopped nature having its own influence on culture. So while the I guess geographical element is sort of fading away, it is still a huge part. Okay, so now the simplest method of understanding culture is empathy. All right, what I mean by empathy, and if you haven't heard the term before, empathy refers to basically putting yourself in someone else's perspective, or to basically be sympathetic to their beliefs, their values, and sort of pretend, if you will, to look at the world through their eyes for a moment. It requires you to ask questions about what would I do if I was in their situation. So it is a little bit of, I guess, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, as empathy generally refers to, but it is a lot more about trying to understand what you would do if you're in their situation. So it requires you, first of all, to avoid stereotypes, and this is probably the most important one out of a lot of them. Now, the reason why I say avoiding stereotypes is the most important is because that's where everyone starts with, and they're usually wrong. Sympathy, as in it requires you to be sympathetic. It requires you to not make prejudgments based on the things that they do. It requires open-mindedness. Again, that's related to sympathy, and again, it's to do with the idea and the notion that you need to keep an open mind, and you need to sort of go, oh, that's another way you can do it. It's not the other way, the wrong way. Awareness, as in to keep an eye out, to keep a lookout, to watch things, to see things, to look for things. Okay, so not to just simply go, oh, well, I've seen everything and move along, but actually keep being aware and to keep trying to find out more. Sensitivity, as in particularly with a number of cultures, you do have to be sensitive the way you discuss certain things, particularly certain taboos. So to be sensitive means that you're not only being a little bit sympathetic, but you're also really understanding in a way that you can basically know what you can't be talking about, know what you shouldn't be talking about, know the sorts of things which have deeply affected and certainly emotionally divided a number of people living within that culture or within that cultural group. So sensitivity is probably one of the more important ones as well. Interest, actually having a genuine interest, not a feigned interest. And particularly if you're talking to someone, the last thing you want to do is you don't want to be sort of pretending, oh, yeah, I'm only interested in you because I'm reading a story at the moment about people from your culture, and you might help me. I mean, that's not really the right attitude. You need to really take an interest in other people, learn other ways of living and other lifestyles, because you might pick up a few things. And finally, research. Now, research is not only the if all else fails method. Research is essentially a starting point, finding out more, and to have that natural inquiry process, to be inquisitive. That's the sort of thing that you need to do, and that's the heart of what empathy is, and the heart of what asking questions is to basically be inquisitive and really want to know, really want to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Not do it because of necessity, but because you actually want to learn a little bit more. So try and take it as something where you can be interested in someone else and not necessarily just do it because it's an English task and you've got a book which is written from a different perspective and you don't quite understand it. All right, so use it as an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the world in which you live. I know it might sound a little bit sort of sad and sappy to be sort of talking like that, but the thing is, once you do it, you'll be surprised how much you actually find you have in common, or you find it's actually interesting about them. Okay, so avoiding stereotypes. Now, as I mentioned before, it's the first thing that you do. And the reason why is basically, not only should you, first of all, identify those stereotypes, you basically need to understand why they're wrong. And basically, they're assumptions which are made by people who live on the outside. So if you're looking at a stereotype of Australia, the only people who spread the Australian stereotype are people who don't live in Australia and don't even know an Australian quite often. And they only know it through what they've seen through literature, through television shows, through popular culture and all the rest, which is not reflective of Australia at all. And certainly none of us go riding around in kangaroos with cork hats on. So if you basically make that assumption about any other culture, you're doing the exact same thing that others do to us. And the reason why I guess a lot of Australians may look a little bit dorky on the international stage, because of the fact that people think that they are something else, which they're not. So you need to identify what those stereotypes are so you can avoid them straight away. Because if you, as I said, if you go straight towards a stereotype, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be basically ignoring the truth and the insight of reason why you're looking at cultural perspectives in the first place. You need to look from an insider's rather than from an outsider's perspective. So as in, you want to be looking at it from their own point of view, not someone else's. So you don't want to be looking at it from an outside looking in saying, oh, this is how all they live. You're saying that, well, basically, it's the way that someone else can live. It's the way that the sorts of things that they do every day, to actually take a sympathetic look at it and to sort of say, okay, if I was in their situation, how would my day look? What would my life look like? Now, again, in terms of why do you do this, it's very simple, because if you're trying to understand someone's point of view, that someone's culture, then the simple thing that you're doing is you're basically incorporating their views and the ones that you can understand. So once you go back to the text that you're looking at, or to whatever it is that you're doing, you immediately have a distinct understanding and a very strong impression about what it's trying to say, and you basically can connect with it a lot better. And by connecting with it, it means you understand it better, it means it's much easier to get a grips with, and it means that you're overall going to find it much, much easier to study it. And that's just purely on the back of actually just doing a little bit of legwork and researching. Okay, but where do you need to go? How do you find this stuff out? Well, first of all, you don't need to do a vast amount of research or become an expert in their culture. It's the last thing you really want to do. All right, if you're trying to become a cultural expert, you're really sort of missing the point of why you're looking for it in the first place. You just need to be able to discuss culture effectively. That's all you need to do. Now, a very quick web search is sufficient. You don't need to go off and expand into a number of different sources and watch a whole heap of films and watch a whole heap of documentaries that tell you all about this culture and this group of people and what they do and how they do it. You don't need to. You can just simply use a very quick search, maybe look at a couple of different materials and go, okay, I have a little bit more of an idea now. That will give you enough as a starting point, and then you can use the text to fill in the rest of your gaps. And if there are still gaps at the end, then you can look up a little bit more and find out a bit more about things. So you should be looking for information relating to, first of all, lifestyles and habits. So anything that can tell you a bit about the way that they live each day, so their socioeconomic status, the types of houses they live in, the types of their village structure, their daily habits, their daily routines. Do they work long days, short days, so forth. Their history and experience. So what's the history of their people? What have they done? What leads them up to this point? Their customs and practices. So not just the tokenistic things, but how they actually do live every day, and how they actually do go into even just something as simple as do their grocery shopping, if there's any particular customs or practices they must partake in order to do that. The family and gender roles, actually how the family works and who's in charge, and how gender roles work. So do women have a say? Do men have a say? Is it both? Is it neither? Or, well, wouldn't be neither, but does one dominate? And finally, issues and challenges. So issues that confront and challenge a particular group of people, and ones which are basically representative of their actual problems and not necessarily ones that have been sort of manufactured for the sake of a TV show or drama. So you're looking at their real problems and their real issues. Okay, and we're going to look at this in terms of an example. So we're going to look at this example as or for an example, the New Zealand Maori. All right. Now, they're indigenous people of New Zealand of Polynesian origin. And when you look at them, you'll probably, when you, think of a Maori person, you think of the image there. Someone with tattoos on their face, their tongue out, and so forth. But not all Maori people live like that, and certainly not everyone has that kind of body art. First of all, many of their customs have assimilated into broader New Zealand culture, which means that a lot of Europeans have taken on a lot of the Maori culture as part of their own as well. So the culture between the Maori and Europeans have sort of blended in together, and it's become a lot more, I wouldn't call it homogenous, but it's one which has sort of assimilated and become part of it. Now, the reason for that is basically the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, where a lot of Maori people had more civil rights, particularly than a lot of other indigenous period peoples at the time. So they were able to sort of fit more readily into European culture. That being said, though, there were a number of tense moments and land ownership issues which still persist today. And that's not to ignore the fact that a lot of Europeans still intrude onto Maori land, and there were a lot of conflicts over that land that they were basically intruding into. And also as the Maori population declined, courtesy of European expansion and diseases which started to, as they did with a lot of other cultures that Europeans came into contact with, started to really spread disease quite furiously. So there were a number of periods of tension following that, and there are still periods of tension where particularly there are still protest groups which are still trying to claim some rights for Maori land ownership. All right, some traditional practices and language skills are still ongoing, but only in roughly about a quarter of their households. Okay, so not everyone, and not all of them basically do it to an extreme level. Some may still do it to an extreme level. I didn't go any further in the research to learn more about that, but one thing I did find through the research is that only a quarter of Maori homes really still engage with the traditional practices and language in some way. So it's one of those things, again, that not everyone is exactly the same, and there are a number of subtle differences. And the other thing which you do get out of, I guess, this research as well, certainly one of the things that came up frequently in the research, was social issues such as life expectancy, income status, and crime rate are issues within that community, and quite prominent issues, and ones which many people in New Zealand are still trying to address. So when you look at these things in perspective, and certainly looking at in terms of the stereotype, well, we had the stereotype before. We had just someone who, as I said, looks like that image. But in terms of the actual people, the real people and their real stories, there's a lot more to them. And certainly, I wouldn't claim to have expert knowledge, but I have at least a little bit more of an appreciation, and certainly a lot more of a deeper understanding of their culture. Now, obviously, as I said before, it's not so deep that I could write a thesis, and certainly I wouldn't claim to be fully understanding of their culture and their position. But one thing I can say through that is I can basically be able to write about sorts of ideas that can permeate stories of Maori people, and particularly in terms of their cultural references, and in terms of the things which do come through their storytelling. So I can start to see some of those things, and then I can start to sort of fill in the gaps as I go further into it. But that sort of research only took about 20 minutes, and really gave a whole heap of extra knowledge that should I encounter a text which really discusses or goes deeply into Maori attitudes, Maori beliefs, Maori culture, I'd have a lot more of an idea of what it's actually talking about. Okay, so in summary, understanding culture helps you to understand text. You really need to do it. And you really need to go, as I said, even if it's 20 minutes, a quick web search will help you find out a whole lot, and to get you past that basic stereotype. It's influenced by different perspectives. So that there are a number of perspectives that exist within the same community, the same culture, the same group of people. And finally, try and look at it from an insider's perspective, as in look at someone who lives within a community rather than someone who's commenting on them from an outside perspective. All right, because you're going to get a much deeper understanding, and certainly you're going to avoid the sort of tokenistic stereotypes that you'll often get if you're just reading something that has completely nothing to do with the values and the value systems of those who actually do associate themselves as being part of that culture. And that's basically it for understanding cultural perspectives. So until next time, see you later.